and the other case where the something is the object of the awareness. Now I want to give you an example that will make that obvious. As I stand here, I'm aware of this cup. I'm also aware of a slight headache, a slight pain. Okay, it comes from the stuff I drank last night. Okay, so I'm aware of a headache and I'm aware of a cup. The awareness is radically different. In the awareness of the headache is not the object of the awareness. The headache is identical with the awareness. And I want to call that the constitutive sense. There's a constitutive sense of awareness where the awareness is constituted by the thing I'm aware of. But when I'm aware of the cup isn't constitutive of my awareness. It is the object, or the intentional object, of my awareness. And I want to say this fallacy pervades all of the examples that I know of the arguments to refute this. Even the most influential argument today is the argument from science that says, we know from science that when you see an object, you don't actually see the object. What happens is that the striking of the photons on the photoreceptor cell sets up an extremely complicated but wonderful series of neuron firings going through the 5 layers of cells in the retina, over the optic chiasma to the lateral genic. I won't tell you the whole damn story, but eventually the idea is that way back here in the brain, there's a little event that occurs, and that's what you actually see. You actually see the picture that the brain constructs of the object, not the object itself. I want to say that's the same fallacy. Of course, there is an experience in your brain. There's a conscious mental event that occurs in the brain. But that conscious mental event isn't the object of the experience. It is the experience. That's the constitutive sense of a notion of awareness of, perceives, conscious of, etc., as opposed to the intentional sense. So, okay, this is the first substantive claim I'm making, and that is, I mean, let's put it in strong terms so in the discussion we can discuss it. The single greatest disaster in philosophy over the past 400 years is the rejection of naive realism. And I can tell you in some detail why it's a disaster. If you have doubts, go read Hegel or whatever your favorite is. And that disaster rests on a simple fallacy. It's a fallacy of ambiguity over the intentional sense of the perceptual and psychological verbs and the constitutive sense. Between the sense of awareness of, where the awareness is of an intentional object, as I am now aware of this marking pen, and the awareness of, where the awareness of identifies something that's constitutive of the awareness. In the case of the headache is identical with the awareness. In the case of the pen is not identical with the awareness. It is the object of the awareness. Now, I mean, the message here is essentially Wittgensteinian, that this enormously powerful philosophical tradition rests on a simple grammatical fallacy. It rests on the fallacy of confusing the intentionalistic sense of the verbs of perception and consciousness with a constitutive sense. It assumes that because you're aware of something in the hallucination case, and you're aware of something in the veridical case, and since they're indistinguishable, they must receive the same analysis. But that's a fallacy because there are two senses of awareness. Okay, now so I've made two strong claims so far, namely that there is this disaster, and I can explain to you why it's a disaster. Essentially, it's a disaster because it makes an answer to skepticism impossible. You're now locked in your own sensory experiences. The most ingenious attempt to overcome that was Kant's with the transcendental idealism. But it is a disaster, and the disaster rests on a simple fallacy of ambiguity between the intentionalistic sense and the constitutive sense of the verbs of consciousness and perception. Okay, now all of that then is to lead into my next main topic, which is the intentionality of visual experience. Now, intentionality has always been an embarrassment to analytic philosophers. Well, partly because it sounds like continental philosophy, it sounds like Brentano or somebody. But the reason I think it's been an embarrassment is that the methods of analytic philosophy have been more attuned to language, and intentionality is only derivatively a linguistic phenomenon. It is primarily a psychological phenomenon that then has a linguistic application. All right, so now let me review some of the fundamental features of intentionality, and we'll see how they apply to visual experiences. Intentionality is simply that feature of the mind by which it is directed at, or about, or of, or concerns objects and states of affairs in the world, independent of itself. So belief, hopes, fears, desires, all of the emotions are intentionalistic in this sense. And I'm going to argue, so is perception. Indeed, perception and intentional action are the biologically most basic forms of intentionality, along with things like hunger and thirst, basic biological needs. But the intentionality of visual experiences has some features that the intentionality of belief and desire don't have. Philosophers in the analytic tradition have tended to concentrate on sentences about intentionality rather than on the intentionality itself, and that's been a source of confusion. And English speakers have problems with this because intentionality with a T sounds an awful lot like intentionality with an S. You've got to listen very carefully if you can hear the difference between intentionality with an S and intentionality with a T. But they're radically different phenomena. Intentionality with an S is a feature of sentences by which they fail tests for extensionality. Intentionality with a T is the property of the mind by which it's directed at, or about, or of objects and states of affairs in the world. Another source of confusion for English speakers, but I assume not for you, is that intentionality sounds a lot like intending, and it makes it look as if intending, as in intending to go to the movies, is the primary form of mental operation. But that's just an accident of pronunciation. We got this word from German-speaking philosophers, and in German, intentionality does not sound like Absicht, right? I mean, there are lots of confusions in German, but that's not a source of confusion. Okay, but if we avoid those confusions, and we just to say, we're going to concentrate on intentionality with a T, that feature of the mind by which it is directed at, or about, or of objects and states of affairs in the world, then our target this morning is going to be the intentionality of visual perception. And I have to say, it's an odd fact that many philosophers, at least in the analytic tradition, are unwilling to grant the intentionality of visual perception. Routinely, they deny that perception is an intentional phenomenon. Now, it's hard for me to argue with them because I think it's obvious that it's an intentional phenomenon. In fact, it's the basic form, along with intentional action and things like hunger and thirst, biologically speaking, the basic form of intentionality. But my colleague John Campbell says, in a correspondence we had, he said, well, it's hard to assimilate perception to an intentionalistic framework. I want to say it is the framework. The other stuff like belief and desire, they're down the line. They're much more derivative than the gutsy stuff, which is in perception and intentional action. So the first thing I'm going to do is justify the claim that perception is intentionalistic. Then my second task will be to identify some of the special features of the intentionality of perception. Okay, now how are we going for speed? Am I going too fast? Everybody looks like they're up with it, so I'll just keep going at this rate of speed. Okay, well, the first way to justify the claim that perception is intentionalistic is to show that it satisfies the definition I gave you. The definition says that a phenomenon is intentional if it's directed at, or about, or of objects and states of affairs in the world. And I want to say it's obvious that intentionality, that